When Elizabeth I died on 24th March 1603, her ladies-in-waiting began preparing her body for burial. And that's when they found something she'd kept hidden for decades. A ring. But not just any ring. A locket ring, hinged to open. Inside were two miniature portraits. One showed Elizabeth herself. The other showed a woman the court had been forbidden to discuss for over 60 years. Anne Boleyn, her mother. Historians call it the Chequers Ring. Elizabeth had worn it against her skin until the moment she stopped breathing. 45 years on the throne. 45 years of rarely speaking her mother's name in public. And 45 years of carrying Anne's face in secret. Now, here's what's strange. The standard explanation for Elizabeth's famous refusal to marry is political pragmatism. She kept England independent. She played France against Spain. She wielded her eligibility like a weapon. All true, but that explanation doesn't account for the ring. Why would a purely pragmatic queen, one supposedly unmoved by sentiment, keep her executed mother's portrait hidden against her heart for half a century? Maybe the real answer is darker and more personal. Let's go back to the beginning. Not Elizabeth's beginning, her mother's ending. May 19th, 1536, Tower Green, London. A French swordsman, imported specially from Calais because Henry VIII had granted his wife the mercy of a clean death. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, stood before the small crowd that had gathered to watch her die. She was approximately 35 years old. The night before, she had joked grimly to the constable of the tower about her fate. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she told him, "and I have a little neck." Then she put her hands around her throat and laughed. Her final words offered prayers for the king. The charges against her? Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn. Conspiracy to murder the king. The trials had been conducted between 12th and 15th of May, verdicts that historians now regard as predetermined. George was executed on the 17th. Anne followed 2 days later. Here's what actually killed Anne Boleyn, though. Not adultery, not conspiracy. She'd failed to produce a male heir. In January 1536, she had miscarried a fetus that appeared to be male, approximately 15 weeks into the pregnancy. Within 4 months of that miscarriage, she was dead. Henry VIII didn't just want sons. He needed them, desperately. He had watched his own father emerge from the Wars of the Roses, decades of civil war that erupted when the English succession was unclear. Henry understood what happened when there was no obvious male heir. Blood, chaos, the extinction of dynasties. A daughter, in the political wisdom of his age, wasn't a solution. She would marry, her husband would become king, England would be subordinated to foreign interests. Henry needed sons, or England would burn. This obsession drove every major decision of his reign. He broke England's 1,000-year communion with Rome, specifically to marry Anne after the Pope refused to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. An entire religious revolution, the English Reformation, undertaken fundamentally to produce legitimate male heirs. And Anne had given him a daughter. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was beheaded. She was at Hunsdon House in Hertfordshire, far from London, far too young to witness or comprehend what was happening. Children that age retain few, if any, conscious memories. But here's the thing. What Elizabeth experienced in the immediate aftermath was concrete and devastating. On 1st July 1536, 43 days after Anne's execution, Parliament passed the Second Act of Succession. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title. She went from Princess of England to simply the Lady Elizabeth. Her household was gutted. Servants dismissed, budgets slashed. Lady Bryan, her governess, wrote urgently to Thomas Cromwell that the child lacked proper clothing, neither gown nor kirtle nor petticoat. She was growing out of what little she had with nothing to replace it. The girl who had been dressed in cloth of gold, attended by hundreds, suddenly had no importance at all. Henry had a new wife within 11 days of Anne's death, Jane Seymour. The court's attention turned entirely toward the hope of a legitimate male heir. Elizabeth? An inconvenience, a reminder of failure, best forgotten. Henry got his son, Edward, born 12th October 1537. Jane Seymour died 12 days later from puerperal fever, but Henry had what he'd been seeking. He continued marrying afterward, Anne of Cleves in January 1540, Catherine Howard later that same year, Catherine Parr in July 1543, always hoping for additional sons, always disappointed. Catherine Howard was executed in February 1542 on charges similar to those that had killed Anne Boleyn. She was perhaps 17 years old. By the time Henry died on 28 January 1547, the tally was this: 6 wives, 2 executed, 2 divorced, 1 dead in childbirth, 1 surviving, and only 1 legitimate son. But Elizabeth? Elizabeth was growing into something Henry hadn't anticipated, something dangerous. She was brilliant. Roger Ascham, one of the foremost classical scholars in England, tutored her as a teenager. He later wrote that, "Her mind has no womanly weakness, her perseverance is equal to that of a man, and her memory long keeps what it quickly picks up." By age 11, Elizabeth was composing letters in elegant Italian. At 13, she translated Marguerite of Navarre's Mirror of the Sinful Soul from French into English and presented the bound manuscript to Catherine Parr as a New Year's gift. She read Greek and Latin before breakfast, studied rhetoric and philosophy, played musical instruments with documented skill. Contemporary accounts consistently describe her as exceptional, a child prodigy surrounded by people who had known Anne Boleyn personally. Her governess, Cat Ashley, had served in Anne's household before Elizabeth's birth and remained her closest confidant for decades. Matthew Parker, who would later become Elizabeth's first Archbishop of Canterbury, had been Anne Boleyn's personal chaplain. The official story that Anne had been a traitor and adulteress justly executed was available to anyone who asked. Think about that. A child genius, surrounded by people who knew the truth, watching her father execute wife after wife in his desperate pursuit of male heirs, watching her half-sister Mary reduced to a servant, learning, slowly, piece by piece, that her mother had died because she'd produced a daughter instead of a son. What conclusions would such a child draw? Here's something the previous video didn't explain, and it's crucial. When Edward VI lay dying in 1553, he didn't just skip over Mary in the succession. He skipped over Elizabeth, too. Both of them. He settled the crown on Lady Jane Grey instead. Why? Edward was Protestant. Elizabeth was Protestant. If Edward wanted to preserve the Reformation his father had begun, why not choose Elizabeth? The answer reveals how precarious Elizabeth's position actually was. Both Mary and Elizabeth remained technically illegitimate under existing law. The second act of succession that had bastardized them in 1536 was never formally repealed. Henry's later acts restored them to the succession, but never actually re-legitimized them. More importantly, Edward and his chief advisor John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, wanted a successor they could control. Lady Jane Grey was married to Northumberland's son Guildford Dudley. If Jane became queen, Northumberland would become the power behind the throne. Neither Mary nor Elizabeth offered that kind of manipulability. And here's the other thing about Elizabeth at 19. She might marry and produce heirs of her own. Any husband she took would likely demand real power. Elizabeth as queen meant Elizabeth's husband as king. Unpredictable, uncontrollable. Better to bypass her entirely. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. Her reign lasted 9 days before Mary rallied support in East Anglia and swept into London in triumph. Elizabeth's behavior during this crisis, characteristically careful. She didn't immediately rally to Mary's cause. She waited until the outcome was clear, then presented herself as a loyal sister. Watch, wait, survive. The relationship between Elizabeth and Mary deserves more complexity than it usually gets. They were half-sisters, 17 years apart in age, shaped by radically different experiences. Mary had been the adored Princess of Wales before Anne Boleyn's rise reduced her to a servant in Elizabeth's infant household. That humiliation scarred her permanently. And yet, they shared something too. Both had been declared bastards. Both had been stripped of their titles. Both had survived their father's unpredictable favor. Mary initially treated Elizabeth with warmth, including her in the coronation procession. The warmth didn't last. Elizabeth became the inevitable focus for Protestant opposition to Mary's rule. Every plot against Mary's throne named Elizabeth as the alternative. The Wyatt Rebellion of January to February 1554 aimed to depose Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne. It failed. Elizabeth was arrested in March 1554 and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Tower, where her mother had been executed. She spent 2 months there before being transferred to house arrest at Woodstock. She protested her innocence in letters to Mary, including the famous Tide letter, where she begged for an audience. "I've never been a traitor," she wrote. She called herself a true-born Englishwoman. The evidence of her direct involvement was genuinely thin. Mary couldn't bring herself to execute her sister, but she couldn't trust her either. Elizabeth remained under suspicion for the rest of Mary's reign. She attended Mass, outwardly conformed to Catholic practice, avoided any statement that could be construed as disloyalty. Mary married Philip II of Spain, experienced what she believed were 2 pregnancies. Neither produced a child. Her health deteriorated through 1558. On November 17, 1558, Mary died. She reportedly acknowledged Elizabeth as her successor in her final hours. Elizabeth was 25 years old, and she was queen. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Parliament petitioned Elizabeth to marry in their very first session. The pressure began almost immediately, and Elizabeth's response, delivered on February 10, 1559, established the rhetorical framework she would maintain for the rest of her reign. She thanked them for their concern, acknowledged the importance of succession, and then deflected. She would be content, she said, if a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin. She showed them the coronation ring on her finger, indicated she considered herself already married to England. This is the origin of the Married to England legend, and the standard historical interpretation frames it as brilliant political strategy, which it was. As long as Elizabeth remained unmarried, she remained the most valuable prize in European diplomacy. Every major power believed it might eventually secure England through marriage. The moment she married, she would become someone's wife. Her value as an independent prize eliminated. She maintained this leverage until she was biologically incapable of bearing children. But look at what she was actually doing, not just what she was saying. The suitors accumulated across decades. Archduke Charles of Austria negotiations kept alive for years without committing. Eric XIV of Sweden declined. Philip II of Spain, her dead sister's widower, refused. The Duke of Anjou, later Henri III of France, negotiations dragged on. His younger brother Francis, Duke of Alençon, courted her personally in the late 1570s and early 1580s. Elizabeth seemed genuinely fond of him, called him her frog, wore a frog-shaped jewel he'd given her. The match came closer to conclusion than any other. It, too, failed. Francis died in 1584. Elizabeth reportedly mourned him. And Robert Dudley, the man she almost certainly loved. They'd known each other since childhood. Both had been prisoners in the Tower during Mary's reign. Their intimacy was evident to everyone at court. Rumors of an affair swirled for years. She never married him. She granted him lands, titles, influence, but never made him king. When he married Lettice Knowles in secret in 1578, Elizabeth was furious. She banished Lettice from court permanently, but eventually reconciled with Dudley, who remained in her favor until his death in 1588. Parliament kept pressing. In 1566, they withheld subsidies until she addressed the succession. She responded with unusual anger, told them that "the marks on my face are the marks of the one whom I shall marry," and that she would live and die a virgin. Her counselors, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh chief among them, pleaded with her to name an heir, provide security for the realm. She refused both to marry and to designate a successor. "I am not so stupid as to be unaware of the dangers that might come from that quarter," she reportedly told them. She understood that a named successor would become a rival power center, someone for ambitious men to court instead of herself. Strategic? Absolutely. But notice something else. Some viewers have argued that Mary and Elizabeth only ruled because men allowed them to, that Tudor women had no real agency, that the power structures of the 16th century made female rule essentially nominal. Fair enough. Let's look at what Elizabeth actually did with those power structures. She surrounded herself with brilliant, ambitious men. William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, Christopher Hatton, Robert Devereux. And she kept them competing against each other for her favor. She rewarded them inconsistently, granted titles and estates one day, subjected them to icy disfavor the next. This wasn't caprice, it was deliberate policy. A favorite who felt secure might grow independent. One who constantly feared losing the Queen's love remained devoted and controllable. When Robert Dudley grew too presumptuous, she withdrew her favor. When Walter Raleigh married without her permission, she imprisoned him briefly in the Tower. She played France against Spain, used marriage negotiations to extract concessions from both, strung along suitors for decades while extracting every diplomatic advantage. The men around Elizabeth thought they were manipulating her, petitioning her, guiding her. What they didn't realize was that she was manipulating them, every single one of them, for 45 years. This wasn't a woman being allowed to rule. This was a woman running circles around every man in Europe. So, the pragmatic interpretation. Elizabeth remained unmarried because it served England's interests, because it preserved her independence, because marriage would have subordinated her to a husband. All true. But consider this. Henry VIII tore apart a 1,000-year-old church to produce a male heir, executed 2 wives, declared 2 daughters illegitimate, married 6 women, spent his entire reign in desperate pursuit of sons to continue his bloodline. The Tudor dynasty was everything to him. He was willing to kill for it. And Elizabeth, the daughter he'd declared illegitimate, the child of the wife he'd murdered, watched all of this, understood all of this, carried her mother's portrait against her heart for decades. And then she let the bloodline die. She had 45 years to produce an heir, 45 years to continue the Tudor line. She didn't. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Stuart, not a Tudor. The dynasty Henry had killed for ended with Elizabeth. Now, I can't prove she did this deliberately. I can't prove the locket was a reminder of what she was doing and why. I can't climb inside Elizabeth's head and extract her motives. But look at the evidence. A child genius watching her father execute her mother for failing to produce a son. Growing up knowing she was alive only because she might someday be useful. Learning, piece by piece, that her existence was always contingent, never guaranteed. Spending 5 years under her sister's suspicious eye, imprisoned in the tower where Anne had died. And then, finally, power. Real power. For 45 years. She could have married. She could have produced heirs. She could have given Henry what he'd wanted so desperately, the continuation of his bloodline, secured by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She didn't, and the whole time she wore her mother's portrait hidden against her skin, never speaking Anne's name, never publicly mourning her, but carrying her face everywhere, always. The Chequers Ring wasn't sentiment, it was a reminder. Henry VIII wanted a dynasty more than anything in the world. He got Elizabeth instead, and Elizabeth, patient, brilliant, relentless Elizabeth, ensured he never got what he killed for. That's not pragmatic politics. That's revenge. The ring survives. You can see it today. 2 tiny portraits facing each other inside a locket small enough to hide. A daughter who never forgot. A mother who was never avenged. Until she was. Elizabeth Tudor died on 24th March, 1603. She had reigned for 45 years. She had never married. She had never produced an heir. And the Tudor dynasty died with her. Henry VIII broke a church and killed a queen, chasing sons. His daughter made sure it was all for nothing. Subscribe for more stories like this.